Hello, it is spooky season, so let's talk about spooky things. And what better spooky things to talk about than a horror story? Today, I would like to talk about the novella N by Stephen King, which can be found in the Just After Sunset collection. And I feel like I need to preface this whole conversation first by saying my dogs refuse to let me record a video in peace, so there's a lot of that. But second of all, I am not a Stephen King fan. Reading N was, first of all, assigned reading for a class, but second of all, kind of a last-ditch attempt to see if maybe I could vibe with King, and it's not my thing. And a lot of that comes down to personal taste and not necessarily judgment on him as an author or his readership. I have particular expectations for the genre of horror that he just doesn't quite meet for me. So with that sort of disclaimer out of the way, we're gonna dive into N. I realized while reading N some of the things that particularly grind my gears about Stephen King's writing. Generalized structure of the story, it uses sort of this found document kind of structure, where the first section is a letter from the sister of the, I'll say, primary protagonist. And it's sort of a reflective after the events of the story that we are about to read. And she's writing to a childhood friend. And in this letter, she says that she found all these files, which is basically the story that we are about to read, asking the friend to take a look at it. So then the next section or two are really focused on basically our protagonist, who is a therapist working with a client named N, who is experiencing these sort of OCD symptoms. So I think this story is fine if you're looking for vibes. The story definitely gave me kind of the sense of watching a movie I had seen before. Part of it may have just been because it was so formulaic. I have nothing against, formulaic stories. Figure we talk about formula in romance a lot because those are so easily identifiable. Horror has those same exact tropes. Not those same exact tropes, but horror also has tropes just like romance does, just like action does, just like sci-fi does, just like fantasy does. They all have their tropes. They all have their formulas. There is nothing against the formula.
Back to formula.
And it's a little harder to kind of hide the formula in a short form like a novella. So I don't fault that. I more fault the fact that King, in his own writing, tends to give away the whole story. One of my favorite things within a horror story is the unexpected. I don't want to know where I'm going next. I want to experience the next. Similarly, I also want to have hope for a brighter future. Whether or not that hope is fulfilled is irrelevant. If the story ends on a very sad, tragic, dark note, that's fine. I am content with that. But until we reach that point of no return, I want to have that hope. I don't want to know the ending. I want to experience the ending as it's happening. So when we get to N, there is no surprise. None. Zero. Zilch. The whole story is basically laid out in the first section with the letter from the sister. She talks about what happened to her brother, the protagonist. She talks about how his story ended, combined with this use of the formula and how there were no surprises for me throughout this story. So I'm going to jump into spoilery territory. This is one of those stories that I'm going to say, if you haven't read it, I think it's okay for you to stick around for spoilers because it's very predictable. Honestly, if you are going to read it, it is reading it more for the vibes than it is for learning what happens next. But this is also your warning. If you don't want to be spoiled, now is your time. Okay. In the letter from the sister in the first section, straight off the gate, basically spoils the fact that her brother has committed suicide. Combined with the fact that we're getting this file talking about her brother's experience with this client, it's pretty clear that what happened to him has something to do with this client. And as we're reading through N's experiences, it's pretty clear that we are foreshadowing what's to come for Johnny. Because N has these OCD symptoms that he's pretty certain is linked to what's going on with Ackerman's Field. And we do talk N through kind of his experience as the year progressed. So some of it is N in retrospect, considering he finally went to a therapist in, I think, around May, June. And these symptoms first started up in August. And so he talks about how they get worse in the summer and easier in the winter. And Johnny sort of discounts a lot of what's happening, which to me raises some red flags, but we'll get to that in a minute. But then we kind of get this, I'll say, hinge point in the story, where N has passed away, and then Johnny is curious. He basically wants to write up something on N, because N was such a unique character, and Johnny's thinking he's going to contribute something new to his field, which is, it's valid enough. And so Johnny goes to Ackerman's Field just to see, because he needs to, see the spaces that N has been to get an idea of where N was coming from. And then the curse falls upon him. We're basically watching Johnny go through all of the same symptoms that N experienced, right down to things calming down a lot in the winter, and him thinking he's been freed of whatever it was. He likens it to catching a cold from his client, and that's why he was getting these OCD symptoms. And then they spark back up as spring approaches. And then he ends up killing himself. And then we get that second letter from the sister where it's pretty obvious that she went to Ackerman's Field, and she's freaking out, and she's sending this letter back to the childhood friend saying basically, hey, don't come here, everything's fine. And then she kills herself, and we get this newspaper clipping talking about how she killed herself. And then the story ends, again, basically, in a way that suggests that the story will continue on, where the childhood friend is sending a memo to his colleague or secretary or whomever saying, hey, I'm gonna go see what's going on out here, because both of these people that I grew up with just off themselves. There was no moment in the story that I really felt any suspense. I knew where it was going from that first letter. I wasn't entirely sure exactly what was going to happen in between, but I knew where it was going, which made me feel a lot less tension as we were dealing with Johnny, because we know from the beginning that he is going to kill himself. And we know from N's story how Johnny is going to experience these symptoms. So truly, you have the entire story in the first half, and the second half is basically just mirroring the first. At no point did I feel like I was on unstable ground. At no point was I really questioning, what is going to happen next. At no point did I think that Johnny was going to solve the mystery of Ackerman's Field. There was never any kind of hope of that given. Even as far as kind of the beginning of Johnny having these episodes, the moment that he decided he was going to Ackerman's Field, you knew that he was going to get the same curse that N had. The only thing that kind of hit as a surprise was the fact that the sister also went to Ackerman's Field, but even at that, wasn't really surprising. We didn't see the sister that much for it to really be a question. What I did like, I feel like I need to sprinkle a little bit of positivity in here, because I feel like I'm just gonna rip the story apart if I don't stop right now and talk about what I did like about the story. I did like that it was primarily Johnny's notes. I feel like we could have done without the letters from the sister. I feel like it being a self-contained story of just the notes would have been perfect. And I did appreciate kind of that mirroring effect to a degree. Because on the one hand, it took away some of the suspense because we knew what was going to happen. I think a lot of that comes down to, again, that initial letter from the sister where it tells us what happened to Johnny. I think had that been eliminated, the mirroring effect would have worked even better. And that's where it comes down to me saying it really is more of a experience, because we do hear and talk about his symptoms and how things get better and worse and better and worse. And then we start to actually see it in Johnny. Because at first, Johnny is very skeptical, Basically, this guy has OCD. I can only take what he's saying with a grain of salt. And then he starts to experience it himself, and we're going through this process of disbelief, his feeling that he's more or less caught a mental cold from his previous client. And then his also like false belief that things were getting better come December, and then things dramatically getting so much worse as April came around. And it was also nice to kind of have this separation from the character to where we could see what he's not really putting together, which could also be taken as a frustration, but I enjoyed that part more than I thought I would. And that's also where I would almost suggest, if you do read N, skip the sister's letter, go straight to section 2, the case notes. Basically just read sections 2, 3, and 4, and you'll have a good time. And that's where we start to get into the nitty-gritty and back into Naked Town. I can appreciate having some sort of preface to explain where these case files came from. What I don't appreciate is the sister's voice. She was annoying. The first paragraph focuses on Sheila, the sister's previous crush on the childhood friend, which feels like a lot of time to sit with this crush that she had as a child when she is now a, quote, happily married woman with a little boy. Are you really happily married, Sheila, or are you lying to yourself? But this also feels kind of like a case of Chekhov's gun. We are establishing a crush, which suggests that there might be some romantic tension between Charlie and Sheila that will maybe be addressed later in the story, which is even more emphasized because at the end of the letter, she has a PS in which she states, quote, "Oi, such a crush I had on you." First of all, who uses oi? But second of all, why are we emphasizing this crush so heavily? In section 4, when we are focusing just on Johnny and his experience with these OCD-like symptoms, and things have gotten better and it's December and he's with his family, he has a conversation with Sheila in which Sheila talks about Charlie and how she had a crush on him. So once again, I'm thinking, okay, something is going to come of this crush that Sheila has with Charlie. I know that it will not happen in Johnny's narrative for the simple fact that Johnny's narrative takes place before the first letter. But there is so much emphasis on this. Sheila's personality is basically wrapped up in the fact that she has a crush on Charlie. But nothing comes of it. Absolutely nothing. The only kind of inkling of a thing that I feel like you could maybe wrap up into this crush is the fact that she responds back to him and says, "Hey, please don't come here. Save yourself." But even that feels more like basic human decency than, "Hey, I had a crush on you, so now I'm gonna save your life." No. And to jump ahead to her second letter, her second and final letter, I should say, she tells Charlie that there is nothing in Ackerman's field, which, like, that is not the thing that you say to a person when you don't want them to go to Ackerman's field. That is, like, the perfect description of reverse psychology. If she really wanted to keep him away, she should have just been upfront and like, "Hey, my brother was right. There's this weird thing. Do not go there because otherwise this thing is just going to keep on continuing." Or, "Hey, I went to Ackerman's field and now I'm feeling kind of weird. Maybe don't go there." Not, "Hey, don't go there. There's nothing there. I promise there's nothing there. You won't find anything if you go there, so don't go there." If there's nothing there, then why should I not go there? Tell me, Sheila. So in Johnny's case notes, Johnny uses interesting language to describe some of the movements of his client N. Particularly on, it's page 277, it's near the beginning of case notes, and has his fingers laced together, just sort of sitting, with his hands like this, as if he fears they might fly away unless he exerts a certain amount of pressure to keep them where they are. The particular problem that I have with this description is it's making certain assumptions about a client that is going to ultimately color his overall view of the client if he were to review these notes later, first of all. But it also suggests a certain bias that Johnny has about his client from this very first meeting. He is already kind of putting words in N's mouth about what N is thinking and how N is feeling, which is a major red flag to me just as a therapist. On the very next page within the same, session, Johnny is basically imagining N in a particular situation, and it goes as, quote, "He's laying awake, trying to imagine what it will be like to tell a psychiatrist that he fears for his sanity, and when he did it, I neither ran shrieking from the room nor called for the men in white coats." Again, he is being very presumptive about what N is thinking and feeling and what N is expecting. And this does not feel like a healthy start to this psychiatrist-client relationship. I understand the use of metaphors and exaggeration to help recall a situation, but the level of bias within this and the level of assuming this client's thoughts and thought patterns just does not vibe well with me personally. The other issue that I have specifically with this session is N keeps on hinting at Ackerman's Field, which I understand as a piece of fiction that this is meant to sort of pique the audience's curiosity, but putting myself in Johnny's position, this seems to me like the client is trying to talk about this and the psychiatrist is just not biting, and he just keeps on changing the subject. Does not seem like the best way to get him to open up about the situation, So presumably there were 2 more sessions, June 7th and June 14th. There's no information on them. I'm assuming it's just redacted notes or sessions that did not receive notes but that they did meet, because N then has homework that he brings to the June 28th session. I'm not really sure why we're missing those dates. It is what it is. It was a little confusing, but it's fine. But presumably this is their 4th session together, and Johnny asks if he's ready to talk about what happened last August with Ackerman's Field. And I'm just like, this man has been ready to talk about it since the first day that he sat down in your chair. Why did it take this long? Why have you not let him talk about it until now? This is unrelated, but on page 291, N has started talking about, where he had this phenomenon happen to him. And Johnny is starting to think about where this was and how close it was to his childhood home, and he knows exactly where N is talking about. And Johnny, in his notes, says, quote, "I don't believe in ESP, but I don't entirely discount it either," when N looks over at him. And I'm just, this is such a weird random thought. And I don't discount that Johnny may have thought this. Like, it's not raising red flags like the other thoughts did. But I also think about the context that we're seeing this in. Again, assuming it's a found file, this would be something that Johnny would have written down in his notes, and this does not feel like something that would come out in the notes. So jumping forward into N's narrative, I actually quite enjoyed his storytelling. I did find a little weird, it was on page 298 of my copy, and I think this is like the first session of basically recording N's story, just a transcription of it, and N says, quote, "I shifted my position a little and saw it was just a trick of the evening light, which thickens shadows and makes them look like, well, like anything," end quote. This just felt like such a voice break for me, and I know this sounds really nitpicky, but it really kind of broke me out of the flow of N's voice. And I think it's just the imagery of the evening light, which thickens shadows, which does not sound like a normal person would talk. Again, I feel like it sounds nitpicky, but also it's one of those things that sounds beautiful. Like, it gives just the right sort of creepy vibe. But it's not the way that people talk. It does not match the voice of how N would describe these things. So I don't know why it's phrased like that. And as much as I like the description, it does not fit, and therefore in this context, I do not like it. Aside from that, I think most of N's session I really enjoyed. And truly, I feel like the whole story could have just been N's narrative because it was really good and it was really captivating. But then we jump back into the fourth section, which starts off in a way that feels weird to me, and I don't know if this is normal practice or if this raises red flags for other people too. But N has committed suicide, and so Johnny calls the home number, at which point he basically opens up conversations with his family. And while he doesn't state that he's like talking about anything that happened in the sessions necessarily, it does feel like a client's privacy violation. I know the client's dead and I don't know how much that privacy stuff like legally is impactful once somebody's dead, but I just imagine what if N hadn't talked to anybody about the fact that he was going to therapy, and now there's this therapist calling saying, hey, I know this dude is dead, I'm here. On the one hand, I get it because it does provide an opportunity to provide therapy and counseling for a grieving family, so it makes sense on that front, but at the same time, it feels weird to me that, like, what if N hadn't talked about going to therapy and now, you know, he's outed as having gone to therapy when maybe he didn't want anyone to know. I'm mixed on it. If you're a therapist and you're watching this and you've read this story, let me know your thoughts on that, because I feel weird about it. I'm very mixed on the fact. But before Johnny even goes to Ackerman's Field himself, he starts to focus on numbers. Just in this first date in his manuscript, thinking about numbers and what are good numbers and what are bad numbers. But then he does eventually go to Ackerman's Field, and there he finds an envelope that N had left behind for him, and that includes the key to the gate so that he can pass through a little bit easier. And then we get the spiral, which again was done really well. It's done just overtly enough that it's not like super in your face about it. Like, I am developing these symptoms. I'm going crazy. I am the new N. That's not how it plays out. There's a lot of denial that comes from Johnny, which I think helps to heighten just the vibes. All of the vibes. And it really is emphasizing that if you paid attention in the first half, this part will kind of like be a payoff for paying attention to what was happening to N in the first half. Another thing that I did appreciate with this was the use of humor. There's not a lot of humor in this piece. Horror generally doesn't call for a lot of humor, but to have a little bit of humor generally helps to make the darker moments feel even darker, just by contrast. And so that April 1st, 2008 entry, it's April Fool's and the fool is me, is hilarious. I loved it. That stated, there's a whole conversation in December about the Fail Road Bridge, in which they more or less talk about how if somebody were to jump off of this bridge, they would die. Which, like, is a weird thing to have a childhood memory of. But it's, you know, it's fine. Those kids probably needed therapy, so it's not a surprise that Johnny went into behavioral sciences. Anyways, considering we already know that Johnny is going to kill himself, and for how much Fail Road Bridge has been kind of like a character in the story, adding in this conversation, we know exactly where Johnny's gonna go. We know how Johnny's gonna kill himself. There is no surprise. None. Zero. And like, I had a suspicion that this bridge was gonna be where he was gonna kill himself before this conversation happened, because it just felt like there was such an emphasis on this bridge. So when this conversation happened, I'm just like, well, this wasn't even a fun reveal. It just is. One thing that confused me towards the end of Johnny's manuscript, I understand that it was partially meant to be a illustration of how he was sort of losing his faculties because of this curse. But Johnny started making a lot of typographical errors, misspelling of words, using more phonetic spelling than actual spelling. Sometimes kind of mixing up letters. Some of them genuinely didn't make sense to me why this was happening. First of all, this was not a symptom that N described happening to him. So this felt like a new, unique thing to Johnny, which, okay. But the typos themselves didn't really contextually make sense. I feel like it may have made more sense if, since we're focused so much on numbers and how certain numbers are good and some are bad, if some of these words, the typos were made such to make them be a certain length. I don't know. The typos just, I felt like something could have happened with it and nothing did. Another thing that kind of annoyed me, and this is genuinely a personal pet peeve and getting real nitpicky here, but the punctuation. In the first letter, there's this like exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. Towards the end of Johnny's manuscript, there is the section where he is using like 8 exclamation points. I don't know the exact number, I didn't count, but there are way too many exclamation points in this like document. I just genuinely don't like it in stories when there's this much punctuation. So we jump into the second letter from the sister, which is quite frankly boring. She has looked up Charlie on Wikipedia to find out about his family, and she's more or less saying, you have more to lose than I do. Which is such a weird thing to say, considering it's pretty clear she's already been to Ackerman's Field, so it's not like a situation of, who are we going to send to Ackerman's Field to find out what's happening there? She's clearly already gone, so she's clearly already going to go through this situation. Why does it matter if Charlie has more to lose than she does? I already talked about kind of that reverse psychology thing, but I don't get is why Charlie, despite getting these letters, unless we're supposed to believe that he's just ignored these letters, why is he deciding, hey, I'm gonna go find out what's happening, I'm just gonna leave my job and do this thing? Why is that like his gut instinct? That doesn't, it feels like such a horror movie trope. This dude that just like, I'm gonna go to the scary place and find out what's happening, despite what everybody else is telling me what not to do. Yeah. So I've been sitting here talking about this book for about an hour now, which means that this video is going to be longer than I needed it to be, but it's fine. I'm probably not going to pick up Stephen King again unless it's like a required reading situation. It's just not my vibe, which is a little disappointing because he is so prolific and so well known and so respected within kind of the horror writing genre that I wanted to like him. I wanted to find it enjoyable, and I don't. With that, let me know down in the comments below what your thoughts are on Stephen King and or the story N. Did you enjoy it? Do you like his writing? Do you dislike his writing? Why not? Let's have a conversation in the comments. And also, while you're down there, let me know what other spooky content I should make. It's going to be October very, very soon, and I'm excited for it, and I want to do some spooky stuff. Also, while you're down there, be sure to hit that like button. I think it's in one of these corners, and also subscribe to my channel. I post a new video at least every Wednesday for whatever Wednesday, which has lately been a lot of book talks, but I've also done some crafting and stuff, so, you know, you never know what you're gonna get. Yeah, I will see you next week and have a very spooky day. Okay, bye-bye!